Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalie Orsling, and I am an assistant director here at UChicago in alumni career development. You are joining us today during our Young Professionals series, which is aimed at providing resources, tips, tools, and support to alumni who are entering the workforce, making a career change, or simply looking to grow in their career and facing new and unique challenges. That is one of the things this webinar is about today. Welcome to Intentional Investing, where we will discuss how you can use your money to not only build your wealth in the future, but also ensure your investing gives back and creates change in ways that matters to you. We are joined today by Michelle Waymire. Michelle is a fiduciary financial advisor and coach, as well as founder of Young and Scrappy. Young and Scrappy is a specialty practice geared towards serving young professionals, entrepreneurs, and the LGBTQ community as they begin their journey into financial planning and investment. Michelle graduated from UChicago in 2011 with a degree in international studies and went on to earn her MBA from the University of Tennessee, became a chartered financial analyst charter holder, and a certified financial planner. We are very excited to have Michelle here today to share her knowledge on intentional investing. Before we do so, I want to say that if you have any questions to ask, we will be doing a Q&A session at the end, so please submit those via the Q&A option on the webinar. Michelle, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It is a total delight to be here, and especially getting to talk about one of my very favorite topics, intentional investing. So as Natalie said, my name is Michelle Waymire. I'm an alum. I am your trusty money nerd guide through this journey. So before we get into this, I want to give a couple of disclaimers, and this is a necessary evil because of the nature of the conversation we're having. Anytime I'm talking about investing, unfortunately, I have to say this stuff. So investing is inherently risky, so please be careful as you're making these kinds of decisions about your money. As you're reviewing, researching investments, it's really common to come across past performance indicators, but just as a disclaimer, past performance does not guarantee future results of any investment product whatsoever. And there's no one right strategy out there. In fact, we're going to talk a lot about how personal investing is. And so just be aware that there's no optimal strategy. You're not going to hear a lot about specific companies or funds that I like, or investment picks or hot stocks or anything like that today. So just be aware kind of some of the constraints of our conversation. What we will be talking about today is giving you a little bit of an introduction to SRI, or socially responsible investing. In the last decade or so, this has been a particularly hot topic. I get a lot of questions about this, more than almost anything else in the investing space. We'll talk a lot about what it means in theory, but then we'll also talk about how it relates to you as a personal investor. So really figuring out how you can assess your personal values and start to screen for some investments that actually align with those things. And then we'll close out, not to get too technical, but with just a couple of practices or tips for taking some of those holdings that you've chosen and working them into your investment portfolio if you're doing hands-on management for that work. So just as an intro to socially responsible investing, for those of you who are not familiar with the topic, or we're starting from scratch here, when we're thinking about SRI, we are looking specifically at investments that consider both the traditional investment risk and return spectrum and also positive social and environmental impact. So I think when we think about SRI investing, there's this feeling that there's a trade-off there, that it's not as good as traditional investing, but it's worth it because you get to do what's in line with your values. I want to start right out the gate and provide you this alternate definition, because I think with any investment, if you're looking to build wealth on the way to your most important financial goals, the ideal outcome is actually that you do both of these things, that you make money through the investment, and also that there is this element of social or environmental impact as a result. There's also a lot of synonyms out there floating around for SRI. I would say SRIs may be a little bit more common, but sustainable investing, impact, green, ethical investing, these are terms that all kind of fall under this same umbrella. ESG investing, we'll spend a little bit more time later on unpacking that one in particular. That's environmental, social, and governance. So if you're seeing any of these words out there, we're going to assume for now, without getting too much into the nuances, that again, we're looking both to gain the investment return, manage risk, but also to have an impact on the world around us. SRI has actually been around for a really, really long time, just not necessarily in the way that we know it today. The origins of, we'll consider, socially responsible investing were actually geared towards filtering out things from a religious standpoint. So major monotheistic religions all have some element of financial and investment constraints to them: Judaism, Islam, Christianity. And just to give you a couple of examples, Quakers are a type of Christians. When they are investing, they're looking very carefully at weapons manufacturers, filtering out companies that contribute to global violence. On the other hand, if you are a Methodist and you're looking to invest, you might be interested in screening out things like tobacco or alcohol or gambling. Sharia law in Islam actually has some pretty strict considerations about what the investment engagement looks like. There's a prohibition on usury or collecting interest. And so if you were following a Sharia law oriented investment strategy, you might be allowed to do short-term investments, but for example, things like gold and silver are actually not typically allowed. So that obviously morphed into what we know today over the last several decades. And I think we can really see a more modern take on social responsibility cropping up in the 60s and 70s. So we're seeing this emphasis on civil rights with the civil rights movement, racial inequality being called out in a way that it hadn't been previously, anti-war sentiment, especially with the war in Vietnam, and environmental activism. I mean, 1970 was the first Earth Day. So we're sort of seeing this for arguably millennia, certainly hundreds and hundreds of years, we've been filtering investments in order to meet our values. And it's really in the last several decades that we're seeing it now newly applied. 1970 was also a really interesting time for socially responsible investing, because that's also when we start to see people put pressure on companies specifically to make better decisions on behalf, not just of shareholders, not just to maximize profit, but also from an ethical standpoint. So Ralph Nader in 1970 managed to get 2 proxy votes on the General Motors annual ballot. Every year, the shareholders come together and they vote on big issues that are impacting that company. And one of the votes was, should we add 3 board seats in order to make sure that the company better represented the general populace? Another proxy vote in this General Motors ballot was to try and see whether the cars were actually safe enough for people to drive, whether they were safe enough from an environmental standpoint. And before that time, there was never really any shareholder input on those kinds of issues. We're seeing this movement pick up speed in 1984 with the U.S. Sustainable Investment Forum, or USIF, created. So that is an organization specifically designed to help filter, screen, analyze, and advocate for intentional investments. In 1985, we're starting to see more hands-on actual movement here. There were, along with the apartheid fight in South Africa, Columbia University students had a sit-in to get the university's endowment fund to divest until Nelson Mandela was freed. In 1990, it's picking up steam to this standpoint that people are starting to realize, like, wait a minute, this is not just a passing trend. This is not stereotypical, people with signs picketing something. This is actually a serious and important part of our investment world that we need to start really analyzing, researching, and doing a better job of measuring the performance of these types of investments, and really start to answer the question, what does sustainable investing do for us as investors, as well as as people with values? So in 1990, the first socially responsible index, the Domini Social Index, is constructed. And now we finally, for the first time, have an actual benchmark to measure our investment performance against. This is a pretty big deal, but one thing that I want to point out to you is that, this was only about 30 years ago that the investment world started moving away from seeing it as like a countercultural edge case to an actual part of the investment universe. So we've come a long way, even in the last 30 years, and again, especially in the last decade. This movement is not going anywhere. It is definitely growing. Over time, we are seeing more and more people pour money into socially responsible investing. We're seeing a wider range of causes. We're seeing more funds available than ever before. And so at the end of 2020, according to a Reuters article, and this was actually an article on a study done by Morningstar, which is one of the biggest investment research firms, sustainable funds had $1.65 trillion in assets. So again, we're not talking about like a couple of people dabbling in green stocks. Like this is a very major part of the investment universe at this point. I would be remiss not to mention that over the last couple of decades, however, there's also been a lot of backlash towards social responsibility investing. And specifically, people have made the argument that it's actually less effective than traditional investing, getting back to this idea that there's a trade-off here, that you're giving up return, you're seeing reduced performance in order to invest with your values, that maybe it's more risky to engage in socially responsible investing. And certainly, if you're targeting one specific piece of the investment universe, that could also result in a lack of diversification that can be pretty problematic for your long-term goals. And then higher fees as well, an argument constantly levied against SRI funds. But that said, since then, especially in, I believe in 2016 and even more recently than that, there have been a number of studies done reviewing all of the research on SRI and all of the previous papers published and articles published to try and get a sense for in what cases is there less performance? In what cases is the risk management an issue here? And now that we have much better data, we have much better ability to analyze these types of funds. There's enough of them to have like a robust sample size. Now studies are showing that SRI investing actually does have fairly comparable risk and return profile to traditional investments, as long as you're being careful and diversifying your portfolio. I want to show you a quick chart to display what this looks like. So when we're thinking about SRI funds, we like to compare things apples to apples, right? So if you're looking at a SRI fund made of large US company stocks, we want to compare it to other funds that maybe don't have an SRI bent to them, but that are kind of playing in the same universe. Now, if ESG funds did way better than their peers, we would expect them to be in sort of the top percentiles of performance. On the other hand, if ESG funds really didn't have good returns, if they were constantly lagging their competitors, then we would typically expect to see them in the bottom half of performance. And instead, what we see here is that across a lot of different types of funds, US equity, international equity, and bond funds, ESG funds tend to be right in the middle of the pack. So what that says here is you're not necessarily going to drastically outperform the market by investing in these things, but you're also not, we're not seeing evidence that you're giving up a lot by doing so either, which I think is really good because it means you can then make the decision really according to your values and your personal needs, rather than worrying about what you're giving up as you're moving forward. That said, over time, we're actually seeing ESG funds in the last several years. The companies that are doing really well are also the ones that are more socially responsible. Whether that trend's here to stay obviously remains to be seen, but I always want to show this graph in any sort of discussion on this context, because the first thing that I hear from folks is, well, wait a second, aren't you giving up a lot by doing this? The answer is no. So social responsibility comes in a lot of flavors. And so it's really about figuring out what's right for you, figuring out what your personal values look like, and then finding investments that align with those values. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice. Like I said, it's very broadly defined. So rather than looking for the best SRI funds out there, we need to both show what might be the best in a peer group, but more importantly, what causes do you actually care about? Earlier in this presentation, I dropped the acronym ESG. So that stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. And this is just kind of a way of thinking about the types of social responsibility that might be encompassed by this type of investing. We think of the environmental side, I think most frequently, that tends to be what folks are pretty familiar with. So we're looking at things like climate change. Are there greenhouse gas emissions, or to what extent are there these emissions by these companies? For those who have factories or are working in production, how are they managing resources, waste management, water management? Are they using fossil fuels? Is the entire company made for fossil fuels? There are some that also invest in new environmental technologies. Are those companies looking for ways to make their businesses safer and more sustainable for our environment? And then just the feeling of like, are they doing the right stuff to get there where we want to be from an environmental standpoint? There's also this social component to it, however. I think one of the biggest issues recently has been on gender and racial diversity, making sure that the companies have diverse hiring practices, that the management teams are diverse, human rights, consumer protections, animal welfare, animal testing. Those are a couple of other big causes that I hear frequently from folks. And then we've got a couple more like traditional ones, alcohol, tobacco, pornography, gambling. I put this in air quotes, sin stocks is often what they're called. And then certainly the social component involved with our prison industrial complex and weapons industries, gun manufacturing, larger scale weapons, et cetera. And then the one that I think often gets overlooked the most, this has to do with the management of the company itself, and that's the governance side. So is the board of directors actually doing a good job of overseeing the managers of that company? Is the company creating undue influence in elections? Are they contributing company money to other causes? We've seen that a lot recently as well. Employee relations. Are you actually treating your employees with dignity? Are you paying a living wage? Management structure, executive compensation, looking at how much the CEO gets paid relative to the lowest paid employees at that company. And again, just sort of a general, is this company providing a sense of transparency about the way that it's being run and about its ethical framework involved? So this is a really, really wide and diverse set of topics here. And, you know, when it comes to SRI, I think the biggest question is really, what things on that list are actually the most important to you? I mean, looking back at this, there might be things where maybe you're not particularly concerned about whether a company you're investing in sells alcohol, but you really don't want to be involved with somebody who is primarily focused in the fossil fuel industry, right? There might be somebody who is not necessarily worried about animal welfare, but very worried about human rights, or a combination of either. So really asking yourself, what causes on this list are the most important to me? And I think the secondary conversation is equally important. Which are the causes that you're willing to compromise on if needed? And I want to give you a couple examples here, because obviously there's no perfectly ethical company. Ethics or values in this case is so subjectively defined that one person's value might be completely opposite of somebody else. And even within looking at this framework, there are likely going to be values that conflict. Maybe there's an oil company out there, but they have an awesome track record of ethical management. They pay their employees well. They're doing excellent work. Their board of directors is very hands-on, and they're looking to make good in the world and improve their employees' lives, but it's an oil and gas company. You might also see like a tech company. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about gender diversity in the tech space. So what if a company is making good strides on gender diversity, and yet they still have no people of color in management? That can be a problem. You might also, as a hypothetical example, find that you've got a biotech company. They're at the cutting edge of technology. Everything they do is environmentally friendly, but also they test on animals. So really getting clear on what is important to you and what you're willing to compromise makes sense, because as you're reviewing the types of funds and stocks that are available to you, they're probably going to be things that are complete non-starters and probably things that you'd love to see, but you're willing to cut some slack on in order to accommodate your primary targets or your primary values here. I think it's also important when you're thinking about how you want to invest your money, what impact actually means to you. So some people define impact as more of like a positive screening tool. So we're trying to target companies that have good practices. If we know that somebody is doing the right things in the governance area, if we know they're doing the right things with regards to environmental sustainability and diversity, then we want to give them more money. We want to invest more in those companies. Or if we're putting together a broad portfolio, we want to do what's called overweightings. We want a higher percentage that goes there. On the other hand, some people define impact investing as trying to apply some negative screens. So filtering out the companies that we don't agree with, whose values don't align with us, or who might have poor practices in the areas that we value most. In that case, we might be completely screening them out entirely, trying to minimize exposure in the portfolio to those types of companies or funds. Or if you have to invest in it in some case, at least doing your best to say, let's choose something that doesn't have as much exposure to those things. So the bottom line here is some people kind of see impact as a means of harm reduction. So trying to filter out things that we don't want. Other folks are more focused on proactive progress. So trying to overweight things we do want. And then certainly you can try and do kind of a mix of these things as well. I also want to get back to this idea of proxy votes and activism. This is often less relevant to the individual investor, but typically when you are a shareholder of a company, once a year at the annual meeting, there'll be resolutions that you as a shareholder get to vote on. Again, you're one voice among many, but every voice counts. And so looking through those proxy votes can often have ESG considerations. There might be things up for vote that you can use to show your values as an investor as part of that process. A lot of us invest through ETFs or mutual funds, in which case kind of doing some research to see how the managers of those funds with institutional investments, they kind of get to vote proxy votes on behalf of all of the shareholders, looking at their track record, looking and seeing how they've voted in the past for social issues or environmental issues. And more socially responsible funds are actually using this as a selling point to say our managers of funds are not just screening stocks according to our mandate, we're also trying to keep the lines of communication open to those companies and making sure that the proxy votes also reflect the values. Now, the downside here is just like everybody has different values, as a result, it makes it really hard to measure and benchmark the sustainability of something or the impact of something. These tend to also be very subjective terms. There's just not a ton of good universal standards and regulations here, so we haven't quite gotten there yet. But that said, there's a number of organizations that will allow you to take this information about what values you hold and actually filter out and start to screen and rank some funds in order to meet those values. So I want to show you a couple of resources here, just some screenshots from websites that I have found particularly helpful when building SRI portfolios for clients. The first one I mentioned, USSIF, founded back in the 80s. They have since changed their name. They're now officially the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment, but they have a really nice sustainable mutual funds and ETF chart. I will point out, this is a screenshot that I took recently, so this should look pretty similar to the website now. They have a lot of information in here. You can filter by the fund type. You can look at all of the historical performance. You can look at the expense ratios. If you're feeling spicy and you want to get on the risk management side, they also have standard deviations of portfolio returns in here. And you can see the screening and advocacy. If you toggle through these tabs, it will show you what is the focus area for each of these funds and how are they screening for their fund. So for example, if you have there might be a fund that is geared towards Catholic investors. And so their screens are trying to pull out healthcare funds. There might be some screens about alcohol in there. Whereas a fund, again, designed towards a Quaker audience, they might be filtering out prisons and gun manufacturers and weapons manufacturers. So you can actually see the screens that that each fund uses. There's some information on proxy voting. And then some of these funds, unfortunately, because they're a little bit more complex and a little bit more specialized, they have higher account minimums. So you can also see whether there are any constraints on whether you as an average investor can be a part of that fund. This one I think is a little bit more robust and actually a little bit more detail oriented. So there's a company called As You Sow. They're also celebrating their 30th anniversary this year. And they have a tool called Invest Your Values. And so they, whereas USSIF is a little bit more technical, and it's really limited just to funds that call themselves socially responsible, right? You can see here 179 funds. As You Sow's Invest Your Values tool actually looks at the entirety of the ETF and mutual fund universe. So what they're doing instead is they're trying to say like, okay, what are the underlying holdings of these funds? And now let's give each fund a ranking or a letter grade according to how they're doing in that area. So for example, you might have a tech fund that's focused a lot on diversity. They might get an A+ in gender and racial issues, but they might get only a B- in fossil fuel use, right? Maybe they have a coal-powered computer facility. I don't know. The point is you can actually pull up a ticker symbol. You can search a name. You can search if you have your 401k account, for example, and you kind of know what funds are in there and there are specific things you want to look up. You can actually pull up any of those investments, enter in the ticker symbol, and it will give you kind of a report card for that fund across all of the areas that they research. They do have a lot of filters here. So it's actually very cool. They have ones for prison-free funds. They have ones for divestment for fossil fuels. They rank funds on a really wide variety of dimensions. So you can also even download their database of information. You can sort and filter and say, show me only the funds that have an A+ rating in fossil fuels. And then you can kind of go from there. So this one I would say is a lot more detailed and probably a good starting place for you as well. And then with any investment research, I think if you're doing information first on your values and you're giving yourself a list of funds that you think might be a good fit based on what you're interested in investing in, then I always recommend folks follow this up with some more traditional investment research. So not all funds are created equal across the board, right? There are bad mutual funds out there. There are bad ETFs out there that don't have any social responsibility at all. And likewise, there are some SRI funds that are not particularly well managed. You're going to get a lot of range in all cases. So something like Morningstar is also a good complement to this type of work. Again, you can search the name of the fund or the ticker symbol here, and it will pull up a brief report. You can look up past performance, especially since some of the as investor values information does not get very technical on the performance and the fees and the management team. If you kind of know what you want to invest in and you have some ideas, you can then vet them from a more traditional investment standpoint using a tool like Morningstar. I'm also going to include a couple of helpful links in here. I believe this presentation will be sent out afterwards. You can certainly search through all these as well, but the charts, the search tool, and then the full data set download for Invest Your Values with all of the scorecard rankings for the mutual funds can actually be found online as well. So at that point, hopefully you have a really good sense of what your values are, what you're interested in investing in, and then you've taken some steps to say like, okay, well, what are some funds and companies that might actually meet these screening criteria for me? Then it becomes a matter of working them into your portfolio. And I think this is kind of a more challenging topic to cover in a situation like this, because fundamentally what we're talking about today is SRI. We're not getting into a lot of portfolio management basics. We're not doing a lot of investment 101 work. So I want to kind of give you a brief overview of some strategies you can use to put social responsibility at the forefront of your investment strategy without necessarily doing a lot of work. Or if you do like investing and you are interested in something more complex, I'll give you some pointers on how you can do that as well. But the good news is there's actually a pretty wide scale of how you can start to implement some of this stuff. Some of it is very, very easy to implement, not very hands-on. You won't have a lot of control over the specifics, but you can at least start to dabble in ESG work without necessarily feeling like you have to be an investment expert in order to do so. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are plenty of impact investing firms, angel investors, private equity firms who are doing really, really complex and interesting work in this space. But obviously, there's a big difference in what people are willing to take on. And there's also sometimes a big difference in the accessibility of these offerings as well. So I want to present everybody with a few options of how you can get started and how you can start to think about putting these in your portfolio. So I would say the easiest way to do this, if you are an investor and you're kind of starting small, maybe you don't feel super confident as an investor, or you still feel like you have a lot to learn, you're not necessarily ready to choose individual companies. There are actually a lot of really neat websites and tools out there that kind of put your SRI work on autopilot. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this type of work is called robo-advisory work. So basically, it's almost a in between DIYing it and working with an advisor. A lot of the advice you get from a robo advisor is based on a static portfolio or a standard portfolio that their research team puts together. You give the robo advisory tool some information about your goals, your risk tolerance, when you need the money, what it's for. And then the robo advisory tool actually gives you a recommendation and says, based on your goals and risk tolerance, this is what we think your portfolio should look like. A lot of that process is completely automated. So you don't necessarily even have to get in there and pick individual holdings. You can just turn on an SRI feature at a lot of these platforms. So I would consider like a couple of the really big ones, again, have done a lot of work in this area in the last, I would say 3 or 4 years even. The one that immediately comes to mind as having some of the more robust research on SRI work is Betterment. So if you go to betterment.com, this is a robo advisor that offers 3 different social responsibility portfolios. There's one for more general impact, but then they also have one that is specifically designed for social impact, targeting racial and gender diversity, and the climate impact portfolios, which even has like a small sliver of green bonds in it. It's super cool. Wealthfront is another competitor. They've done very similar work. They do have one social responsibility portfolio out there. It's not necessarily as targeted for the specific causes that you care about, but they do have a feature where you can change out or strategically swap out certain holdings in your allocation. So you can kind of take their base portfolio and then you can pull in the funds that are more relevant to you. So that one is less out of the box. It takes a little bit more work to kind of figure out what you want in there. But that's another option for you as well. And then another sort of rising star robo advisor in the last several years is called Elvest. They are actually focused on gender diversity specifically. And so their impact portfolio through their website focuses on women in leadership, women on boards, et cetera. So if you have a sense that you want to get started with investing and you're a little bit more flexible on what goes in the portfolio, I often joke with clients that using a robo advisor is sort of like drinking a LaCroix of intentional investing, right? Like there's not going to be a ton of flavor there. But it's more like a little bit just to kind of make you feel better about where your money is going. It's not going to be quite as targeted, but the benefit here is that it is very, very easy to get started and with minimal money. You can open a lot of these accounts for, you can start $10 a month at Betterment and still feel like you're making a small impact. So I think that accessibility here is really, really nice. Let's say, for example, however, maybe you're a little bit more confident of an investor. You're trying to DIY it to some extent. You're maybe a little bit more comfortable slicing and dicing mutual funds or looking at a comparison chart of what's available. You can actually start to work these into your existing portfolios as well. One approach that I really like that I think it also takes some of the edge off the pressure to like choose the right funds or making sure that what you have is actually going to get good performance or low fees or whatever you're looking for, is the core satellite approach. So rather than saying, let's scrap the whole portfolio and start over from scratch, instead what you might do is say, hey, for the most part, I'm going to use a standard portfolio focused on traditional risk and return, but I'm going to take 5 or 10 or 20% of my portfolio, and I'm going to supplement my traditional investments with a small sliver of SRI funds or stocks. So again, this way you kind of know you're getting like whatever low fees, diversification, whatever your main portfolio is in, you still get to keep those benefits, but then you get to sort of tweak it or customize it towards whatever values or causes are most relevant to you. If you wanted to take that a step further, you could actually build the entire portfolio out of SRI mutual funds. So if you were approaching this from an investment standpoint, you would still start with the process of getting your account open and depositing money in it, and starting to think about the broad strategy behind your account. Maybe you've decided you want a certain mix of US stocks, a certain mix of international stocks, and a certain mix of bonds. So you're kind of starting out the same process, like setting your allocation that's consistent with your goals. But instead of choosing one, ETF that might represent that universe, you can fill those buckets instead with funds that are actually screened according to your values. So for example, instead of putting the S&P 500 in your US stock bucket, you might choose SHE, which is a gender diversity oriented alternative to the S&P 500 that kind of overweights companies that have higher rates of gender diversity in upper management and on the board. So you can sort of build your portfolio, but then put in your SRI holdings into the buckets wherever they're most relevant to you. So if you're already investing, again, don't feel like you have to start from scratch here, but you can start to work these holdings in as makes the most sense for you. Let's say, on the other hand, you have a lot of time to research this. You're really interested in social responsibility. You really want to hyper fine tune exactly what goes into this portfolio and what doesn't go into this portfolio. That puts you in a place where the investment strategy and approach that you need to do a good job is unfortunately a lot more complex. Getting back to this idea of putting a mutual fund in a portfolio, you might be able to find an awesome mutual fund that mostly makes the grade, but at the end of the day, that mutual fund might have dozens, hundreds of holdings in it, and you can't exactly write them a sternly worded letter saying like, look, I really wish you would not put BP in your fund. They may or may not listen. Odds are they won't. So you can't control every single company. And I would argue even because of the way that mutual fund holdings can change over time, it's also kind of impossible to know at any given point the full breadth of companies that are represented in that portfolio. If you want a very, very detailed approach and you want to very strictly screen out certain companies or absolutely guarantee that you're including certain companies, the best way to do that is by building your own portfolio of sustainable stocks. So you will get a lot of customization here, but managing that takes a lot of work. It takes 30 stocks to at least get rid of overall market risk or the diversifiable risk. So even if you have 1 or 2 stocks, unfortunately, that's not a well-diversified portfolio. As a result, it takes a lot of time to pick everything. It takes a lot of time to manage things. If you are trying to make a call on whether those stocks or companies are socially responsible, they could change their policies. They could change the way their management team is set up. They can, there might be proxy votes you don't agree with, right? So it's not just a matter of picking those stocks. You kind of also need to keep pretty good tabs on them to make sure that they're still in line with your highly specific mandate going forward. So managing this takes a lot of work. It unfortunately also can take a lot of money. In order to get enough holdings in there, you can't exactly build your own portfolio of sustainable stocks with $100 or even $1,000 or $10,000. You want a bigger pool of money to make that happen. Lastly, I'll point out to you community investing, impact investing, private equity. When we think of socially responsible investing of like groups that get in there and actually lend to community small businesses, groups that are sort of doing boots on the ground work with regards to impact and investing, getting involved in that type of work, I think, is also very complex because now we're not focused on what you can buy and sell from the comfort of your home on your computer. You can't log into E-Trade and get access to these things. I would say these types of community building groups and funds can be really, really detail oriented. They can do awesome, incredible work. But from an accessibility standpoint, I think that can be really hard for an average investor to get tapped into. A lot of private equity firms have very high minimum investments for this type of work. Sometimes they only take so many investors at a time. It's not an open-end invested thing. And your money can be locked up for quite a long time. It's not like if you decide that you don't like a stock anymore, you can log on to E-Trade and just get rid of it overnight. You can't sell off right away easily. I have seen smaller and more focused impact investment firms where your money can be tied up for 5 to 10 years. For some people, this might be no problem at all. And for others, we might need a little bit more flexibility than that when we're putting SRI in our portfolios. So that's not to say you shouldn't do those things or research them or go down that rabbit hole, but just know that these types of strategies in particular are probably going to be a little bit more appropriate and a little bit more geared towards higher net worth individuals who can handle the potentially higher risk, the higher fees, and the longer lockup periods associated with it. But hopefully this did a good job of at least showing you that if you want to get started investing with intention, you have a really wide range of opportunities to do that. You do not have to have the perfect portfolio to start nudging your investments towards the goals and values that are most important to you. And I think even if you're not building the perfect SRI portfolio of your dreams, I do think you'll feel good doing this work to get a sense of what's important to you, starting to look at what you're already invested in, seeing whether that's aligned with your values, and seeing what small incremental changes you can make to just feel better about where your money is growing. So that is the presentation. I wanted to leave time for questions. So are there any that came in through the Q&A? Have we got anything else to discuss, Natalie?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Michelle. We do have some questions, and if you guys have more as we're starting this Q&A session, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A function or in the chat. But I think the first one, and sort of gearing it to our lens of young professionals, is there are a lot of people that are really excited about this prospect, really excited about the idea of investing sustainably and investing in their values. But right now we are kind of in some uncertain economic times. So what are your suggestions for young professionals who are excited about investing, excited about starting investing in this manner, but are sort of nervous about joining the investing world right now?
Yeah, totally. That is a very valid and topical question. I know that seeing everything going on in the news and seeing the dips that we have experienced in the stock market over the last, 6 to 9 months are very, very stressful for people. One thing that I would offer you is that the timing of the investments becomes a lot less important when your goals are long-term. So here's what I mean by that, right? If you have a goal that's happening in 6 months, in 2 years, in the kind of foreseeable future, I think you're exactly right. I would not mess with the stock market right now. If I knew that I needed the money in 6 months, even if I thought I could put it somewhere sustainable or in line with my values, I would not want to sacrifice the safety of the goal that was important to me. That was something that I would put in a savings account. I would wait for the short-term goal to take place. And if there's anything left, that might be an opportunity to make a donation to a cause you care about. So you can still put your cash to work, even if it's for a short-term goal. On the other hand, let's say you're a little bit nervous about the market, but your primary goal is investing for retirement. If you've got 20, 30 years to go, looking back, there are a lot of challenging market movements that happened 30 years ago, days where the market was down 5% and there's all this turmoil. And looking back now, those types of market movements were just a drop in the ocean compared to how the market has grown over the last 3 decades. So I would offer you the same is true for your longer term goals. I would not let your concern about market movements get in the way of investing for the far off future, even if it does make you a little bit more cautious about the short term future. One other thing that I would say to this end is that if you have maybe a medium term goal, or you know that your goal is long term and you're trying to be logical about it, but there's still some fear there. One thing that I often see folks do is what's called dollar cost averaging. So rather than feeling like you're plunking your money into the market all at once, if you're sitting on a pile of cash or savings that you've been trying to invest but have been a little bit nervous sitting on the sidelines, what you can do instead is not put it in all at once, but set up a monthly deposit so that it gets invested over the course of several months or a year or so. And that way, you know that the market is going to have its ups and downs in the meantime. But some months you'll be buying in when things are high. Sometimes you'll be buying in when things are low, but trusting that on average, you're putting your money in over multiple periods. That can kind of take some of the stress off of like the initial big deposit and seeing the potential for a drop to take place.
Awesome. Yeah. And I guess kind of following on that same lens of investments for different time periods and investments for different reasons. Are there, like, how would you bring in this SRI lens when talking about saving for sort of those midterm goals? So we had a question about how can you save for college with an SRI lens? How can you sort of hit specific goals for your savings while also bringing in mind the social responsibility aspect?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things there. So college savings in particular is a really common midterm goal, but it's also a little bit tricky. Most people save for college in what are called 529 plans. Those all vary by the state. So unfortunately, you might look at 48 different 529 plans. But if you wanted to incorporate SRI, since you can technically invest in 529s from any state, and you can send your kid to college in any state, you might start by screening out what 529 plans specifically allow for this type of investment. Likewise, I would say there are plenty of folks who choose to invest for college, medium-term goals, buying homes, things like that, that they do in a traditional taxable account. And then again, you kind of have the option to pick and choose what your investment like profile looks like there. I will say, if you are really worried about the returns, though, if the sense that like if you need money in 10 years and you're worried that an SRI holding just won't perform as well, then I think that's where you can either fall back to something like the robo investor tools, which will kind of take some of that decision making stress off of you. But also, you can maybe go with something more like a core satellite approach, where you would invest what you would normally do for a 10-year period, but then maybe you're just putting a little bit of SRI in there to make sure that you're feeling good about where your money goes. And I will also add, this is more of like a personal hot take here, but if you ultimately decide that it's not a priority for you to invest intentionally, that's okay too. There's been a long history of some of these holdings not being particularly transparent, not being particularly accessible to people. And I would also argue that when marginalized communities in general build wealth, it also allows you to give back to your community. So just because you're not investing in all SRI mutual funds does not make you a bad person. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a personal preference, and it's your money. So make of that what you will.
Awesome. And then another question, there seems to be out there right now a ton of resources and information on investing in general, on SRIs. How do you sort of weed through what is useful and what is not, what is kind of telling the truth and not, especially when trying to decide maybe a financial advisor to work with, or a specific company that may be like something like you talked about Ellevest and everything, but there are a lot of companies that maybe are kind of trying to tell you that they're doing the same thing. How do you weed through all of those resources to find ones that will actually help you and actually align with your goals?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So yeah, the good thing about the investment community is that there's so much awesome information out there. And the worst thing about it is there's so much bad information out there, which I guess is like true of the internet at large. So the way that I would think about it is the same way that you might like filter your news sources to be less biased. I like investment firms that provide education or investment resources on a wide variety of things rather than a specific topic focus. So here's what I mean by that, right? If you are working, if you're researching an actively managed mutual funds company, all of their literature is going to be about why active management and why those types of mutual funds are the best fit for you. On the other hand, there are a lot of resources. I'll give you a couple of examples. Investopedia. It sounds kind of like a weird resource, but Investopedia has absolutely awesome investment 101 content. NerdWallet, blogs like that that are designed for general education and not specifically associated with a certain investment company or product line tend to be a little bit more trustworthy there. On the actual like working with an advisor side, some of the things that I would look for are how that person gets along with you. I mean, this is surprisingly important. It's like you should have good rapport with your advisor or planner. There are also a number of sites where you can look specifically for advisors who meet certain criteria, advisors who don't take commissions, advisors who don't do complex products like insurance and annuities. I personally, again, another personal hot take, I don't believe in individual stock picking. That's not something that I do, but some people really like that. So there are websites out there that allow you to filter by those kinds of styles and pay structures. So for example, Garrett Financial Network is one, XY Planning Network, and then NAPFA, the National Association for Fee-Only Planners, NAPFA. Those are all great tools that help you find a planner or advisor who does not take commissions or push products.
Awesome. And then I think one final question to wrap it up. So if someone is, just learning about this now and wanting to keep up and maybe keep in the news, keep learning about the news, I guess, or say about the latest trends and issues in impact investing, how would you suggest they make sure that they keep up to date and ensure that, where they've put their money now is where they still want to put their money 5 years from now?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of the resources that I already shared do have some pretty good like news functions to them as well. Morningstar has great financial news. I see them as a fairly unbiased source of that information as opposed to more traditional news outlets that like to recommend specific stocks or companies based on what's happening in the world at large. That stuff I tend to be a little bit wary of as well. I will also say that the As You Sow like mutual fund screener, they have a really good like digest of specific press releases, big proxy votes that are happening. I think their mandate is so so distinctive relative to a regular news source that I would try and lean upon those types of organizations rather than, MSNBC or whatever it is that you like to watch your main news from.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you, Michelle, for joining us today and sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot, and I'm excited to put this knowledge into practice with my own future investments as a young professional. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope you also feel more confident and comfortable in your investing journey. If you missed the first few moments of the panel, don't worry, it has been recorded, and we will be sharing it via our YouTube channel as well as a follow-up email to you all. And if you're interested in attending more sessions of our Young Professional series, I'm going to drop a link in the chat with more information as well as registration links for our upcoming events, so you can join in on the fun and learn some more. We hope to see you all more over the next few weeks. As this session ends, you will see a survey from us here at UChicago Alumni Career Development. Please take a few moments to fill it out so we know how we can best serve you all in future programs. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.